It was supposed to be the morning after the parliamentary night before. Instead, it is the morning before the vote that will decide her future one way or another. Theresa May, still Prime Minister, or former Conservative leader? We should know by dinner time. They do say, don't they, that a week is a long time in politics, but we're only halfway through this one. And for the woman who wants to deliver her Brexit deal, it must already feel like a lifetime. Very, very good to have you along here watching Roundtable with me, David Foster. So, there is a confidence vote against the Prime Minister. Is it a case of saying hello or saying goodbye? It was an unwelcome inheritance. The British Prime Minister came to power nearly 2.5 years ago in the wake of the Brexit referendum. And with it, she was handed the supposed gift of her predecessor's legacy: negotiating a way out of the European Union. It was a legacy that has prompted some of the most turbulent months in modern British politics. She claims to be a fan of the hit British TV show Strictly Come Dancing, but tonight she'll be the one in the spotlight.
So there will now be a vote of confidence in my leadership of the Conservative Party.
As her party votes, not on her dance skills but her leadership skills, they will ultimately decide her fate.
I will contest that vote with everything I've got.
She says her removal would put Brexit at risk and would play into the hands of the opposition. But has she got the necessary moves to fight for her leadership life? OK, let's get the conversation going. Joining us from Brentford, we have Robert Oulds, director of the Bruges Group. That is a Eurosceptic think tank. With me at the round table, we have a rather fresh-faced bunch, myself apart. Oliver Patel, the manager of University College London's European Institute. Tanya Hussain, history student at UCL, who was too young to vote in the 2016 referendum. And Amy Longland, chief operating officer at My Life, My Say, which encourages political engagement by young people. Great to have you all along. Fascinating times, turbulent times. Let me ask you first of all, Oliver, do you think anybody could have done any better than Theresa May, or perhaps any worse?
I do think people could have done better. I'm not going to name any names, but Theresa May has handled this process extremely badly, and I think probably the biggest mistake she's made is she hasn't been, and of course you can't say this in Parliament because it's unparliamentary, but she hasn't been honest with the...
You can't accuse somebody of being a liar, can you?
Well, I can, but MPs can't. She hasn't been honest about Brexit. She hasn't been honest that Brexit involves trade-offs. She has promised to the Remain sympathising MPs that we can have frictionless trade. She's promised to Northern Ireland and the EU that there'll be an open border on the island of Ireland. But she's also promised to her Brexiteers that we'll have great new trade agreements, the freedom to do our own thing, we'll be able to chart our own destiny. So she's promised things which are incompatible. It would have been far better had she, from the beginning, tried to go for a Brexit that would have had a consensus in Parliament and been honest about the trade-offs that that Brexit would entail.
So it's her fault. OK, we'll come back to that in just a moment. Robert, you may remember a couple of weeks ago when we were talking about a similar subject, I wondered if she might be playing brinkmanship and the EU the same thing, that she might go to Brussels and they would say, listen, we're going to help you out. And she would say, great, because that's what we agreed. Now it looks like I've got something rather special. Well, she hasn't, has she?
Well, it's absolutely surprising that the European Union has done so little to help her. She's essentially agreed to almost every single demand the European Union has made of her. It's not really been a negotiation, it's been a capitulation, and yet the European Union is still unwilling to help her out. One that suspects the EU doesn't actually want to deal with the UK, and essentially allowed her to be thrown under the bus. They knew that she couldn't get her agreement through Parliament and her leadership would be in question if she couldn't deliver the one thing she promised, which was making a good deal with the EU. It's been a deal which has been rubbished by both sides of Parliament, Conservative MPs, Labour MPs. Labour is almost unanimously against her deal, as is almost every other every other party in the House of Commons. She's managed to, in a sense, unite the country against her big vision, which really does show that she has no place leading this country.
OK. Tanya, I will come to you in just a second, but Amy, I want to ask you first of all, you're trying to empower young people to get involved in the political process. Are they massively disillusioned, if you can be that general about it?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think one of Theresa May's biggest mistakes that she's made so far is that she hasn't actually spoken to the British populace about what's happening with Brexit. I mean, we did a petition with which 80,000 people signed, asking the Prime Minister to just talk to us about what's going on. And that's a huge thing.
Are you talking about these TV debates that haven't and won't happen?
TV debates or any other form of actually just engaging with us. And I think that's a big mistake that Theresa May has made. And I think generally with young people, we feel incredibly sidelined by the negotiations. In the report that we released a couple of weeks ago, young people really feel as though this debate has been dominated by Westminster elites. So I think although the Prime Minister could have done a lot more, I do think that actually what's going on within her own party and the fact that there's all of this division and she's being completely knifed every step of the way, I think that doesn't actually do a lot for how young people feel about the debate, which is that it's being completely dominated by squabbling within the political party.
When did your group start?
2013.
So 2013, 5 years on, would you say the youth of this country is more engaged in politics, less engaged in politics, more disillusioned with what they see at Westminster, or encouraged that there might be some change? That's your choice in this referendum at this table.
I mean, I think what we really believe at My Life Must Say is that we reject the idea that young people are ever apathetic. We believe that young people actually think politics doesn't really work for them. They don't see it as an avenue to address their issues. And one positive that came out of the EU referendum is that it did politicise a generation, and it did make young people realise that, you know, they need to turn out and vote. They need to become more active in order to actually, you know, affect change. So I think in many respects, young people have realised that there are other forms of being politically active. They can get engaged in their communities in other ways, not just voting. However, I do think that the EU referendum has shown that they can create movements. I mean, Brexit, the EU referendum mobilised me, it mobilised a lot of my peers, and it made us come out and actually join together one way or the other. So I think in many respects, if we can garner that mobilisation of young people now and actually include them in the Brexit negotiations, include their voices, I think there's a lot to...
How old you are?
24.
You're 24, OK, so you did vote. We'll get round to that in a little while. Tanya, I know you're 19. Do you recognise what Amy is saying? And what other avenues are open if you don't think that voting or getting involved in mainstream politics is the right one?
I think it's right that the Brexit referendum did play a role in politicising a generation. I do think that maybe one of the few good things that have come out of the Brexit referendum is that it did instill a sort of, we need to do something, we need to be part of this debate into this generation. The Brexit debate sort of brought politics into everyone's homes. It became a national problem, and in doing so, it brought it to people as old as me. And I think the fact that we also didn't get a say in that also politicised us much more.
When you say do something, do what?
Well, firstly, vote. I think that a lot more people who are slightly older than me who did get a chance to vote, a lot more people were likely to vote in the Brexit referendum than a general election, because it had that sort of difference, it had that sort of urgency that it needed to be dealt with. But also I think the Brexit debate, because it affects people in their day-to-day life, it's a huge decision that is going to impact our future more so than anyone else's, I would argue. I think that that has really made people take notice of what's going on around us. I think it's really easy at my age to become especially when you're at university, it's very easy to become bubbled where you don't really know what's going on in the news, in Parliament. It's not really relevant to us. Because I think the other thing you were saying about becoming disillusioned with politics is also very true. Although it has politicised our generation, I think it's also disillusioned us as well.
I'm going to ask you to do something with Robert. Robert, on the shelf behind you, the book you wrote, pull it down, will you? And it's everything you wanted to know about the EU. Now, I happen to know that Tanya would have voted, I think I'm right in saying this, would have voted to remain.
I would have voted to
remain. You, Robert, think that was the wrong choice. She's a young person. She thinks people like you are controlling the argument that you shouldn't be doing so, that you're not engaging with young people. So try and sell your view to her.
Basically, what we want to do is take back control of our own lawmaking That's the key issue. This was expressed by Jeremy Corbyn in the 2017 general election. Brexit simply means not being subject to the European Court of Justice, where we can make our own laws. This is taking back the future for people like Tanya and other young people who will now have a democracy where they can decide the laws that are made as we go forward, rather than some faceless bureaucracy based in Brussels or a court in Luxembourg. That's the key issue. This is all about young people's future. And that's
but you see, that's not what Tanya thinks. She doesn't think that that is a form of taking back control. I'm sorry, I'm not putting words into your mouth.
No.
But go on, answer him.
I think that it's slightly presumptuous for people to assume what is in the best interest of young people without asking them themselves. I feel like I completely understand that there are problems with the EU, and I'm not arguing that it is the best institution and it doesn't have its problems, because it does. But the idea that we're taking back control, I don't think is one that really holds any resonance.
I think the take back control message was obviously very effective in the referendum, and it was a far more effective campaigning slogan than anything the Remain side put out. There are two problems with it. Firstly, Brexit doesn't necessarily mean take back control. There are different versions of Brexit, and the Brexit which is the least economically damaging, in my view, and in the view of most economists, is one where you remain aligned to EU rules and regulations, because the way that you have less barriers to trade is by higher alignment. So that's one problem with the take back control narrative. The second problem is that a lot of young people actually like the laws and policies which emanate from the European Union. They like policies on environmental protections. They like the high standard of workers' rights. They like freedom of movement. So,
and are you suggesting that all of those things would disappear if we were no longer part of that club?
Not necessarily. What I'm suggesting is to tell young people that now you can have UK parliamentarians making these laws when they see what an absolute shambles the current governing party is. Maybe they would rather have faceless bureaucrats in Brussels making those laws, because they see the current state of affairs in the UK and they see a lot of the benefits to their daily life, things like student exchange, Erasmus, ease of travel.
Do you recognise what Tanya was saying amongst most of the people who you hear from?
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, at My Life, My Say, we do a lot of outreach with young people all across the UK, whether they would leave and remain or couldn't vote like Tanya at the time. And I think what's happened right here is the problem right now, okay? We're dwelling on whether Brexit should have happened or not. And for a lot of young people, you know, a lot of them, especially those that couldn't vote, I mean, these kind of arguments aren't really that helpful now. Okay, what we need to be doing is actually looking at how we can build a future that works for other young people, how we can actually embed them within decision-making processes. I did vote Remain, I have a campaigning background, but that was predominantly, a lot of the work I did was actually informing students, young people who, as Tanya said, you know, were so absorbed in, you know, their first year of uni, trying to get to grips with uni life, that they didn't realise that they weren't registered to vote, or they thought that because they registered back at home with the general election, they could vote at uni. And little things like that, they were just completely misinformed. And even the timing of the referendum, right in the middle of exam period, completely demonstrated that young people just aren't considered in key decision making. And I think what's happening now is that the debate is festering on whether Brexit should have happened. And I think a lot of young people that we speak to, you know, they think Brexit is happening.
Okay, let's stop.
Get on and deliver
can I stop you there?
Everyone.
Because, yes, okay, Brexit probably will happen one way or another. We'll get on to the second referendum perhaps towards the end of this programme. We have a situation where by the time this programme goes out, we will pretty much know whether Theresa May has a future or doesn't have a future. And by this time tomorrow, we may know who's jockeying perhaps to take over from her or follow her orders for another 12 months. Who do you as a young person, Tanya, think perhaps is at all qualified in the Conservative Party at the moment to take this country forward and get the best deal? Any of the candidates that have been mentioned?
Honestly, I don't think there's anyone really in the cabinet that young people really see themselves putting a lot of support behind. I don't think there's one candidate where everyone would rally behind them.
Can I just say really quickly, I think that what's happening, and today is a prime example, I think for a lot of young people, you know, as I said before, our recent piece of research the biggest thing that came out of it was that most young people, however they voted, just feel as though, you know, it's completely dominated by this squabbling amongst politicians. And this morning, you know, just as Tanya demonstrated, there's probably no one better placed to deliver the Brexit. Yes, Theresa May, I personally think that she was going to lose regardless. She couldn't win, you know, and the deal was obviously too much of a compromise to please anyone. But a leadership challenge at this point in time is quite literally, I think, the last thing that young people want to see. And it isn't going to actually benefit negotiations. And it's actually a prime example of Westminster elites dominating the debate, and that is jeopardising the ability to actually deliver a Brexit that could work for young people.
You think most young people would probably rather see us limp on with Theresa May, rather than somebody, let's say David Davis, a man who said he was sidelined because he put forward some really brilliant ideas which were ignored when he was Brexit Secretary? I'm not asking you really for a description of that as accurate or not, because I think that's what you said. Robert, are you interested in the fact, do you find it surprising that somebody who represents or believes they represent or listen to a lot of views from young people think that Theresa May is still the right person?
Not necessarily the right person.
In some ways, she's actually still quite popular throughout the country, which is actually quite surprising considering the poor media coverage. But we talk about the squabbling amongst the politicians. Well, yes, this is bad and it is unedifying, but really it doesn't compare to the squabbling that's happening on the streets of France as we speak, the riots that have been taking place there, which have spread to Belgium and, to a lesser degree, the Netherlands. I'd rather the squabbling in Parliament amongst MPs deciding what's the best way forward, as is their role, than the actual disaster that's happening on the continent of Europe, which has betrayed young people, where we see massive unemployment, particularly amongst the young. And at this moment in time, we have record employment within the UK, and Britain is providing jobs for young people who have fled the continent of Europe, literally fled to get a future, because the European Union has failed them. And coming out of the EU, we are doing so much better. We have better growth, we have better prospects for young people, record levels of foreign direct investment.
Do you think, Robert, and it's very difficult perhaps for you to hear me because you just keep on talking when I'm trying to ask a question, but if you wouldn't mind for a second, are you worried that there could be a second referendum and the vote would go in the opposite direction?
Well, if there will not be a second referendum, quite simply because there's not a parliamentary majority for it, the government does not support it, and quite simply the leaving date has been put into law. We're leaving on the 29th of March 2019 at 11 p.m. That can only be changed by primary legislation. They can't even delay it unless there is primary legislation. And there's simply not time to hold a referendum. It is simply not happening.
Okay.
It is a part of the game.
All right, so you don't think it'll happen. Okay, that's fair enough. Not that you're frightened of it, the result, if it does happen. Oliver?
So I'm not going to predict whether it will or won't happen, but I think it's totally plausible that it would. Before I say why, firstly, if Conservative MPs are allowed to have a second vote, not so long after their first one on who should be the leader, even though Theresa May got a whopping majority last time, then kind of undermines the argument that you're not allowed to vote again. But I think it could happen because Robert's right in saying there's no majority for a second referendum, but there's no majority for anything. The only thing there's a majority for is avoiding no deal. So if MPs can't agree upon a deal, if they don't like Theresa May's deal, if they can't agree upon a Norway-style deal, if they can't agree upon a Canada-style deal, you might get to late January, February, and they might think, well, the only way to avoid no deal is to have another referendum. And of course, the date of withdrawal is in the European Union Withdrawal Act. But if enough MPs want a second referendum to avoid no deal, then enough MPs would also vote to amend the EU Withdrawal Act. So I think it's totally plausible. And the fact that it's written into law doesn't mean that politically it can't happen. Okay. So I wouldn't be so confident in thinking that it won't happen.
Well, we won't go back to that one at the moment.
I mean, I can only speak on kind of the research that we do, and we don't actually have a position on the whole second referendum argument at the moment.
No, but this is supposed to be about young people.
Well, no, but in the research that we do, there isn't an overwhelming majority either way, and I think there's a lot of uncertainty around what exactly it will ask and things like that. But I completely agree with Oliver that if it does get to the point where we're at a deadlock and that the idea of a no deal Brexit is on the table, I think there is an argument for some kind of second referendum, especially for people like Tanya who couldn't vote vote at the time and would have voted to remain, and overwhelmingly are seeing what a shambles is happening at the moment, I think there could be an argument for some way of giving her a say on something that will affect her life the longest out of everyone sat in this room.
Well, because an awful lot of people who did vote leave have now died and been replaced by.
I mean, that's a little bit morbid, David. But
well, no, but I mean, it's as simple
2
as that,
million
isn't it?
young people that couldn't vote back in 2016 can now vote, and I believe that, you know,
an awful lot of people have fallen off the perch as well. That's just the way it goes.
And I think
it's a conveyor belt of life.
And I think the figures show that within young people who couldn't have voted, the majority would have remained. I mean, I can only speak for my own experiences and what I know, but within my school at the time of the referendum, we held our own mock referendum within our school, and it was overwhelmingly Remain.
And in your family as well, in the younger demographic?
Within the younger demographic, Remain. I mean, my family had some leavers, but...
Oh, you say that as though...
I mean, isn't the problem that not enough young people vote? So I know a lot of young people who didn't vote, but if they did, would vote Remain. So it is a bit of an
this
issue.
idea that it was 75% of young people said we must remain, it is slightly spurious, isn't it? Because only 2/3 of young people eligible to vote did vote. Now, if you then extrapolate that, you end up with 2/3 of 75%, which is 50%.
Yeah, I mean, I hear you, but I don't think that argument about young people turning out to vote is really that valid, because, you know, from my experience as a young person, also from the work I do, you know, there's many structural reasons why young people don't vote, and there was a lack of information about the difference between a referendum and a general election at the time, and that, quite frankly, is the government's fault. So young people didn't think, because of our voting system being first past the post, they just assumed that the referendum was the similar system and their vote didn't really matter, and that's just one of the reasons
listen
why.
when they're being told something. Sorry, Robert.
But also,
if somebody doesn't listen when they're being told something, i.e. there's an important referendum coming up, and it will affect your life, and you're very young and you ought to take part in it. If somebody doesn't listen to that, which is what happened with 50%
I don't think it's that they didn't listen.
Whose fault is it? It's not the government's fault, is it?
I do think so, because I did a lot of work actually informing young, but there wasn't enough information out there, and there is, I think there is a vicious circle where young people haven't, you know, historically voted, so they're not considered a kind of really significant. Can I just finish? A significant voting bloc, right? So because they're not considered a significant voting bloc, parties don't address their issues in their manifestos. Because their issues aren't being addressed in party manifestos, young people don't bother voting, and it's a vicious cycle. And I agree.
Let's give it to the younger person.
More young people should have voted. But
Robert, you'll be there in a second.
Is it? It's not
I agree. I think obviously I couldn't have voted, and I wish I could have, and I'm sure a number of people who could have didn't. But as you were saying, there is a big problem with informing young people. I think that everyone assumes that you just need to use the same channels and avenues, and that everyone uses the same thing. But if you're sending information through the post, I'm sorry, but that is not the most effective way to get information across to students. That isn't, and if you think that is, again, you're very, very out of touch.
Okay,
with the young
I like that.
population.
What has the EU ever done for us? Tell me what you think.
Okay, well, I go to UCL, which is an incredibly international university. So many of my professors are from the EU. Many of the people who are in my seminars and my tutorials are from the EU. We have very strong links, Erasmus programs, career opportunities in the EU. So for me, the EU is an opportunity.
Which shows that Britain is a welcoming country.
Exactly.
And why would Britain be any less welcoming after this?
Because it doesn't just have to be about the laws. It's about the environment that Brexit has created. Okay, sure, we may be able to say, okay, even after Brexit, all EU people are welcome here, but do they really feel welcome? Just because you say by law you're fine, your rights are enshrined in our law, that doesn't make them feel any more welcome. I know I have friends who are from the EU, and they cried the day of the Brexit referendum, because to them, they felt like the country that they had made their lives in, the country which they felt they were part of, had completely let them down.
But you see, this is what I don't quite get, and we don't have very much time, is Britain wasn't saying we don't like you Europeans, it was saying we don't like the European Union and what it represents. And these people can still come here.
I'm sure.
They may have to go through
I'm sure that's
quick
what
online.
you're saying.
You can't
but
deny that there isn't like a narrative, and it did increase a lot of negative kind of behaviour.
Immigration was a huge.
But I think ultimately, and that's what came out of our reports as well, is that young people do still feel very connected to Europe, even though some of them had a problem with the EU, and a lot of young people still value, the connections and the kind of ability to travel and work abroad. And I think actually what the referendum exposed was a lot of deep divisions nationally. So, young versus old, educated, like highly educated versus going into jobs, or versus rural. And we should be focusing on actually bridging those divides as well.
I know you all want to have the final word, but of course it should go to the youngest person on our panel. So I'm going to ask you, Tanya, once again, do you think that when you are a parent, perhaps 20 years from now, that Britain will still be here as a force of good or whatever in the world, or is this the end of Britain?
I think Britain will still be here, but who can really say in what form or what sort of...
Optimistic. Be optimistic about the future.
I think it's very hard to be optimistic at this point.
No, it's young people should be optimistic. It's your future now, and we've got
but
a good economy.
It doesn't feel like my future. I didn't get a say in my future. That's the whole entire problem.
Enough. Thank you very much indeed. Yes, Britain will still be here. The question is, will Theresa May? By the time you watch this, we will be pretty close to knowing. By the time we do our next roundtable, we will know. Tune in for that. Thank you for watching this one, and thank you to my guests for taking part. Goodbye for now.